following the same sort of methodology as the last one in terms of where we got the material from.
Yeah, we were lucky to find all sorts of carols. I know that Camborne and Redruth have a kind of a cornerstone of the Cornish caroling tradition, but they are all over Cornwall. And one of the lovely things that we were able to do was look at this 1927 publication by Ben Barnicoat, who had collected manuscripts that had belonged to his great-grandfather. And a lot of this is covered in a little video that we've got later on. But the main thing that came out of this one was, is Tregony in the Roseland? Nev says no to someone from the North Coast. I would say yes, but it's not, is it? No, it's not. But as a gateway to the Roseland, and because this publication hadn't been printed for almost a century, we included them. There are also several in the Cornish Songbook that had included manuscripts of W.C. Dunstan, who at that point was secretary of the London Cornish Association, and they were his grandfather's manuscripts from Portlow. Here's an example that we used later on in the project. So we had musical sources, music books, but Nev also did some great newspaper research.
Yeah, so we just using the National Newspaper Archive, we found accounts of carol services in the Roseland, and we're able to list to find some of the carols from those sources as well. And that was one of them. List Our Merry Carol was one that was sung, I think, in 1902 at Gerrans and at Philly.
Yeah, it was lovely to imagine and uncover some of these carols that probably aren't heard so often anymore. One that definitely hadn't been heard for a very long time is this next item, which again we'll talk about a bit later. But this was a fascinating example of a piece that had been sung in Portlow village, but had dropped out of use completely, and until we came across it with Christine Edwards in Verrian and collaborated with her friend Joyce Gilbert, we were able to reconstruct it with the help of Peter Meanwell, who is director of the Washaway Gallery Choir, and has been a huge help, another collaborator in this project.
One of the things we found was that when they wrote it down, they didn't necessarily put the right words under the right notes. So when you moved them along a bit, it worked a bit better.
Yes, that is what happened. So the second memory day that we had also pulled out a lot of shared memories of carols on the Roseland. We had somebody come and mention carol tours that they remember doing. It's not something that happens ever so in a widespread way so much anymore, but going and visiting houses and singing carols at Christmas was much more widespread, and so it was lovely to hear stories of that. And there were other carols and other sources identified as thanks to her as well.
Yeah, one of them was her story, and we found this person who I hadn't heard of before, Florence Gertrude Stodden, nee Attenborough. She also went under the nom de plume of Christabel, but she was, in the beginning of the 20th century, she became a professional lyricist, and what she was doing was writing the words for music and then publishing them in books or in newspapers, and inviting musicians to come forward and put the music to them. Which they did, and there are scores of her works in the various libraries. And her father was one-time minister at Porthscatho. She married a Cornishman, and although they lived up in England, they did return in the Second World War and lived in Porthscatho, and she's buried in the churchyard of Porthscatho. This was one of the poems that she wrote and published that we don't think was ever put to music.
Yeah, that's lovely. An Easter carol. They're not all Christmas carols. Our next item that we got up there is our Cornish language item, which was lovely to have. So the St Day Carol came to us through a woman called Yvonne Fuller, who was a professional opera singer who had relocated to St Mawes. And in the 70s, she had been involved in a church service that was aiming to have carols in as many languages as they could find. And she wrote to her aunt, who was at that point in Porthscatho, and Portlow. Polperro, apologies, Polperro. So she wrote to the aunt in Polperro, who got in touch with somebody who could speak Cornish and sent her not only a written written lyrics of St Day Carol in Cornish, but also a recording from the 70s of the St Day Carol in Cornish. So that was lovely. So she performed it in this church service in 1973, and then when she came back down to Cornwall, she set up a group called the St Mawes Waits, which sing carols at the Tresanton Hotel every Christmas Eve, and they sing a Cornish language carol at the Tresanton every Christmas Eve.
So we found over 40 carols with connections to the Roseland, and we found one with connected to every parish except Ruin Lanhorn.